Hey, good afternoon. I am super excited to be here. So, as the introduction said, my name is Colonel Tim Spaulding. I'm an 18-year veteran of our United States Air Force. Thanks. So for most of that time, I flew the airplane that's on the screen behind me, the F-15E Strike Eagle, which is a fighter-bomber airplane. Flew in a number of places in Europe and in the Middle East. Doing good work before I got the opportunity to come out to California here and learn how to be a test pilot. I spent the next few years learning how to test airplanes, how to put on new radars, new missiles, new systems. Then I spent a lot of time as sort of the buying end of research and development in the Air Force. That is, working with companies to get us new airplanes, new systems, and that sort of stuff. And I'm gonna, in a couple of weeks, go back out to California, just north of LA, and take over the flight operations business at Edwards Air Force Base to do some more test flying for all the fixed-wing assets in the Air Force. I am here because the last year, Autodesk, one of the sponsors here for CII, was kind enough to host me as the Secretary of Defense Fellow with Autodesk for the year. So the Secretary of Defense sends a number of people at the sort of 15 to 18-year career point out into industry to try to learn something to make the department itself better. Autodesk is one of the places that hosts people there. So I was there in San Francisco for a year, learning all about something I didn't know anything about when I started, which is architecture, engineering, and now, as you know, construction, something that Autodesk is getting very into. So anyway, that's where I come from here. What I'd like to do before I start, though, is give 3 disclaimers. So the first is, the first disclaimer is that I hope that you learn something from what I'm talking about. And to prove that you can learn something, I'm going to say what I learned from this morning's talks, which I did listen to diligently. The first is that Tony Stark was here earlier. I don't know if he's still here. Yes. Okay. The second is that a great thing that was mentioned by Dr. Markham is that no plan survives initial contact with the enemy. That's an awesome military quote. The version of that I like is Eisenhower's quote that he said, "Plans are nothing, planning is everything," which is actually a slightly worse version of saying what Mike Tyson always said about plans, is that everybody always has a plan until I punch him in the nose. But he highlighted that we can learn things across domains, which I think will be really the characteristic of my talk, because I'm not going to tell you about construction. I don't know anything about construction that you don't already know. But I'm going to tell you about aviation, and I'm going to leave it to you to try to draw those lessons back into your industry, which I think you can. From the VR and AR talk, that was super cool, because a lot of those things are going to resonate with what I'm going to talk about, especially empowering the workforce by using VR and AR and having proof points to show that it actually gives you value. So there's a couple of themes that will go there. And then finally, from the policy talk, I've got a degree in policy, so I got to say I might have been one of the only people in the room that was super stoked about the policy talk. I thought it was great, so good on you guys. What it reminded me was of what Leon Trotsky said. This is not what he actually said, but a little bit of a change. He said that you may not be interested in policy, but policy is interested in you. So everyone that does projects knows that's probably true. Okay, so that was the first disclaimer. You got to learn something. The second disclaimer is that I hope that even though I'm standing here talking about my 18 years of experience in my uniform, that you understand that the opinions I express are my personal opinions and learnings, and not necessarily the official position of the United States government or the Department of Defense. And I know you guys will understand that. And the third disclaimer that I want to say is that I gotta want to just give a general apology, because I didn't really think about this before, but you guys are in the capital construction business. And for most of my career, I was in the business of rapidly disassembling those capital projects. So, yeah. Keep it up with the 5,000 PSI concrete. That stuff's tough. Okay, so to get started, we really do have a lot in common, the two industries. And I have a 10-year-old daughter, light of my life. She's going to be a higher star in the firmament than any of us in the room, I'm sure. She's very, very bright, and she's also super skeptical, especially when it comes to dad. And so I told her, hey, we're going to San Diego. She's here with me. I said, we're going to go to San Diego. I'm going to give a talk. She's like, oh, cool. What are you giving a talk about? And I said, I'm going to talk to the Construction Industry Institute. Construction. And she gave me this side eye. She gives me the side eye when she doesn't believe me. She's like, Dad, aren't you a pilot? It's like, yeah. No, but they're very, very similar, the two industries. She's like, side eye again. I said, okay, Charlotte, I'll put it together for you. These are the ways that construction and aviation are totally similar, all right? So number one, we both wear helmets. Yeah, so yeah, that's number one, okay. Number two, total full of loud noises all the way around, okay. Number three, kids grow up wanting to do what we are gonna do, right? And number four, It is super pricey, and it's best done if your rich uncle is paying for the bill. I think everybody could agree with that. So I finished that whole thing. She gave me the side eye, just like that anyway. But really, we do have a lot in common, the two industries. And this is probably the most important thing we have in common, is that we're both riding on rivers of change. All sorts of change, but for sure, technological change. And if in our industries, we refuse to paddle faster than the current of these rivers, then we risk being swamped, sunk, like any kayaker would tell you would happen on a river full of change. So all of us are dealing with this together, and all of us need to be paddling faster than that current. And I think in this industry, I don't have to convince you that if technology is making progress that looks something like this, then we as people are making progress to stay with that technology of something like this, and maybe in the room, construction is making progress to keep with that technology, something like this. And I don't say that to cast spears to the industry, but to tell you that I think you are with me, that this is something that you know that you need to work on. But I want to say I understand why it's difficult. Because I spent the last year in San Francisco and Silicon Valley, and lots of hope and lots of optimism and lots of change and lots of adapting and minimal viable product. But in that industry, they're dealing with bits. And in our industries, we're dealing with atoms. In our industries, we're dealing with people punching in and out of a time clock, and they're dealing with lines of code. In our industry, we're dealing with human beings moving physical objects around the earth. So it is going to be harder for us to adapt to technology than for other industries. What we do is oftentimes dangerous, it's difficult, and it's dirty. So I think it's important that we can learn lessons from one another on how we go forward and deal with those. So automation, and this is a little hard to see. Can you see AR and VR? Those are the two areas that I want to talk about. If we're going to spend the afternoon talking about technological change, we could go in any number of directions. But these are two areas I think are super relevant to you guys, and they're certainly super relevant to aviation and the stories that I'll tell. This is what it looks like for you in automation and AR and VR, right? In fact, I think you saw this picture earlier today. For me, it looks slightly different. This is what automation looks like, and this is what AR and VR looks like. So what I'd like to do for the next 20, 25 minutes or so is walk you through a history of aviation and the military aviation, starting from today and going all the way back to its roots and then coming all the way back to today again, to tell you about how we have adapted to changes in automation and AR and VR. And again, I'm not going to tell you about construction. I can't. But I'm going to leave you with lessons from my field of view, which I think ought to be places where you can take lessons to yourself. So as we go on, throw some questions on the app. We should have some time at the afterward, and I'll answer some questions as well, and then I'll be around afterwards if you want to talk. So those two topic areas give us these three fruits. And these you probably remember, just before lunch, you saw explicitly called out in the AR, VR, and talk. Automation can give us safety, it can give us efficiency, and it can allow us to innovate. So the first one, safety. Okay, just make sure I get the point I want to get here. Tactical aviation. One of the biggest problems that we have faced from the early days of high-performance airplanes is that we learned as pilots that we could maneuver our airplanes more aggressively than our bodies could actually handle. We call that a term, G-induced loss of consciousness, which gets shortened, a good shortening to G-LOC. So if you maneuver your airplane too aggressively, you pass out, you're no longer able to control the airplane, and the airplane crashes. This has been a problem all the way since the World War II days when they started doing 300 and more miles an hour in Spitfires in England. So this has been a constant problem for us. We spend a huge amount of time as pilots training ourselves on how to avoid this, training ourselves physically on how to respond to it, and training ourselves on what to do in case it happens. It has been a major reason for loss of life in our business, in the tactical aviation business. Until today, where we can enter the realm of auto-ground collision avoidance. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you what today's auto-ground collision avoidance looks like. What it is in the big picture is a system where our airplanes can carry a synthetic map of the elevation around them inside the jet. If they know where they are, using GPS or whatever other position-keeping sense, Then they can use their own kinematic model to determine when the aircraft is going to hit the ground and have the aircraft take evasive action if it believes that's going to be the case. It's not a sense and avoid. We're not looking at the ground. We are knowing where the ground is. We are knowing where we are, and we're doing the math so that collision does not happen. So if you want to go ahead and cue the video, this is what it looks like today. All right, so it bears a little explaining what you're about to see. So what you're seeing is a two-ship of F-16 airplanes in the United States Air Force going out to do a mock dogfight. The video you see is from the heads-up display of the student pilot, who you'll hear called number 2. He's the number 2 guy in the formation during the sortie. So you're going to see his video, and you're going to hear his breathing and observe his actions. On the radio, you'll hear his instructor coming across the radio, and he'll identify this person as number 2. What you see on the left of this video, where it says 491, that's your airspeed. That's how fast the airplane's going. On the right side is the altitude. That's how high the airplane is. And then down across the little small black box on the left is the number of Gs that the airplane is pulling. So what you're going to see is the student pulls aggressively to begin a maneuver. Almost instantly passes out from the G-forces, and you can hear it in the tape. The airplane then begins to descend toward the ground at a high rate of speed. And you see the students passed out at this point.
Two recover. Two recover. Two recover. Two recover. Sully, knock it off. Sully 1, knock it off.
Sully 2, knock it off.
2, get yourself back above the floor.
There are 6 other tapes. 16s and
Sully, knock it off. Sully 1, knock it off.
Sully 2, knock it off.
All right, 2, climb back above 12,000.
Okay,
All right,
that we came up with an automation system to save the airplane from hitting the ground, because that's important, right? And it is hard to do, but it was technical and it was done. The real story is that it could have been done earlier. In fact, there were a lot of airplanes across our tactical fleets, both the Air Force and the Navy, that were ready for this technology to be put into place. But the operators weren't that interested in it. The money folks weren't that interested in it. By the way, an airplane costs about $30 million. So you got a pretty good return on investment to go for, not to mention the pilot. The managers weren't that interested in it, right up until the point when they saw that tape. As soon as you see that tape, you cannot not pursue this. And I have proof that you cannot pursue this, because the F-35, which is the airplane that I fly now, implemented this very same technology 8 years ahead of schedule, as soon as the people running the program and the pilots could see this tape. Why do I bring that up? Because I know you have safety ready to go somewhere on your job site, somewhere in your construction, and it's probably going to work. In fact, it is going to work, and it's probably a good ROI. In fact, it is a good ROI, but you can't quite get over the hump to do it until you have proof. And once you have that proof point in your hand, the rush to it will be irresistible, like it was for us. So that's automation for safety. Automation can also be super important for efficiency. So the picture here is of the Than Hoa Bridge in North Vietnam. So this is about 40 years prior to the tape that we just saw before. So this is a super important bridge in North Vietnam, logistically, for the North Vietnamese. And they built it very strong, and they defended it very tenaciously, because they understood if that bridge was destroyed, that would be a major logistics challenge. So in 1965, the Air Force went about trying to destroy this bridge with the technology we had at the time. The technology we had at the time were airdropped weapons, in which trying to get the weapon to the precise point of the target required a ton of manual intervention. It was a gravity bomb. You had to get down low, get as close as you could, and try to hit something with these bombs. So in 1965, we took our first shot at Than Hoa Bridge. It was 46 airplanes making attacks with another 31 in support. We lost 2 airplanes. We did no damage to the bridge. Later on that year, we went with a similar strike package, 48 airplanes, 21 in support. We damaged the bridge, but it was quickly repaired and it stayed in service. And in fact, despite all of the new tactics and the bigger weapons and bringing the Navy in that we attempted to do over the next 7 years, we were unable to destroy this key strategic bridge in North Vietnam. Now, in 1971, we did succeed in destroying that bridge. And the difference, because this strike was only 6 strike airplanes, the difference is that we had taken the guidance part of weapons, which used to be air delivered, you had to get very close, spend most of your time doing that, and we made it automated. We had 2 weapons that we were able to use then. We had been developing for years, but finally perfected. One was a laser-guided weapon that followed a laser spot, and the other was a TV-guided weapon, which you could guide accurately. With those 2 weapons in hand, not more explosive, not better tactics, not better pilots, not more airplanes, with those 2 automation technologies, we dropped the bridge permanently with 1 strike and 6 airplanes. In the previous 7 years, it had been 871 sorties, and we lost 11 aircraft. With the automation technology, we did it with 1 sortie, 6 airplanes, and no losses. So the power of efficiency is there. I want to harp on efficiency because a lot of times efficiency, I think it's bagged on as like, well, you're just optimizing. That was the favorite thing at Autodesk. I love people like, that's just an optimizer. That guy's just an optimizer. He's not thinking big. But sometimes optimizing is thinking big. So if you look at the whole span of taking weapons and automating them, in 1941 to 1991, so European theater and World War II to Desert Storm, we took weapons and automated them and made them more precision such that when I flew a single Strike Eagle, 2 people in it, with the weapons we carried, we could on 1 sortie do the same damage as 530 B-17 sorties. By the way, 10 human beings on every B-17. And by the way, a lot of those not coming back on a sortie. So 5,300 people, and we did the same work with 2. So that's 3 orders, it's more than 3 orders of magnitude difference. So that's what optimizing does if you keep optimizing. And that's what automation can do for efficiency. Maybe not right away, but maybe as you continue on. All right, so a couple cases there, so don't scoff the optimize. All right, innovation. So about 20 years before the story in Vietnam, we were involved in a conflict in Korea. So these are a couple of F-86 Sabres. And I realize that none of these airplanes are on the Midway that you guys saw last night, because remember, that's the Navy. This is their force. So these are F-86 Sabres taken off from Kimpo Air Base in Korea. So this airplane was designed to do one thing, and that is clear the skies of other enemy airplanes. And at the time, this is the pre-missile era, this was all done with aerial gunnery. Aerial gunnery was an amazing thing to take 2 moving objects at 500 miles an hour and shoot a bullet from one to hit the other. It took all of the pilot's time to do. It required amazing eyes, amazing inner ear and ear, a little bit of Kentucky windage as well in order to hit something, and basically all the pilot's task. Well, the engineers, as they were flying in Korea, realized that, you know what, they could take a lot of that lead computation job away from the pilot if they automated it, right? If they could just automate it. And you know what, it's not that hard. They had a little radar. They could tell how far something was out in front of them. They had a little computer, right? It's 1950s. It's not a great computer, but it's enough to do some calculation. They got a little sight. They could make the sight show where the bullets are going to go, and then all the pilot had to do is put the thing on the thing. That's what we call it. Put the thing on the thing, right? And believe it or not, in Korea in 1952 or so, they introduced this to the F-86. And it worked, kind of. It worked. It did the lead calculations and allowed the pilot to do something else besides just maneuver the airplane back in order to take a shot against another airplane. And in the long stretch of fighter history, this revolutionized fighter tactics. So I fly the F-35 today. I spend 0 of my time worrying about Kentucky windage and how to compute lead sight against another person. In fact, I shoot missiles that do even one more step than this. We have fundamentally changed what a fighter pilot can do with an airplane. I can be more creative with tactics than these guys could ever dream of. And even in 10 years, the guys following on were more creative than these guys were in Korea. It really, really, really worked. Okay, so that's it, right? That's a great story. Well, it turns out that when it was introduced, it didn't work that well when it started. And in fact, the guys in Korea didn't like it at all. This is from a cartoon that they published a weapons journal for the guys that were in Korea. And this was the picture they drew of the new gun sight that had been given to them by the engineers in the stateside of the Air Force. And so the context is there is an engineer stomping on a giant big box and just like brute forcing it into the airplane. It was so universally hated when it was introduced that Gabby Gabreski, who had 6 kills in Korea, basically fomented a revolution. Wouldn't use it, came back to the chief of the staff of the Air Force at the time with his colleagues and said, and this is his quote, "I would rather stick a gob of gum on the glare shield and use that to aim than this system that you gave me there." So what's the story there? Not that this isn't the right answer, because in 20 years it was the right answer, and in 40 years it was the right answer, and in 60 years it was the right answer. This is exactly the right answer. And in fact, that automation has cleared whole new fields of endeavor for fighter pilots. But the lesson here is that if you do not design it for your users to use then, they will stick gum on the windshield instead. And they will revolt instead. And I could guarantee if you've worked on a construction site, you've probably seen the equivalent of gum on a windscreen, right? I'm sure there's lots of stories on that. So it's got to be done from the user's perspective, and it's got to be right for the user. If it isn't, it won't take hold, regardless of how right it is. And this was the right answer, as proven in the long run. But it's got to be right for the user at the time. All right. So now I want to shift away from automation. We showed how automation was valuable for safety in terms of auto ground collision avoidance. We talked about how automation was great for efficiency in terms of weapons guidance, by 3 orders of magnitude across 50 years of innovation. And we talked about how automation allows us to innovate and do entirely new types of work that we did before. Now I want to shift into AR and VR. And you guys got a great talk before lunch about AR and VR, and a lot of these things are going to be totally echoed. So I'll try to tie them in as we go. First, augmented reality for safety. So from the early days of aviation, when you flew, when the Wright brothers flew at Kitty Hawk and all the people that followed them on, it was a pretty straightforward manual job. You used your eyes, your ears, your inner ears, and you maintained the airplane as long as it was clear. Turns out that as soon as you lose that visual reference, and you do what they used to call then fog flying, none of those things actually worked. You were totally unable to maintain the airplane in those conditions. Not to say that pilots didn't think they could, because they did. And as soon as they tried that, they found out that they weren't able to do it and oftentimes caused crashes. So they weren't able to do this, right? And so enter this gentleman here, this Lieutenant Jimmy Doolittle, who'd go on later to be General Jimmy Doolittle. Very, very famous for the raid he led on Tokyo during the war from a Navy carrier, another story. But before that, he was a lieutenant in New York trying to learn how to fog fly. And the answer was augmented reality. The things that were available to the pilot did not allow the pilot to operate safely in the weather. The eyes weren't there anymore. Your inner ear was lying to you. You had no way to maintain up from down and left to right. So he invented and then tested a gyro, attitude gyro, right? So if you know anything about how gyros work, it's spinning real fast. It's going to stay stable no matter how the airplane moves around it. Always tell the pilot what's wings level, what's up, what's down. So this instrument is classic. It's really early augmented reality, right? The pilot now looks at the dash and has a truth source that tells him about the world, right? I guess it would be mixed reality based on the conversation earlier, right? That he can see or she can see that says, hey, this is where the world's supposed to be. And as you might imagine, pilots weren't real receptive to that, right? Nobody wants to stare at a gauge instead of flying by the seat of your pants. Nobody thinks they need it, even though they're out there crashing. So this is another great example of proof points. What you see is Jimmy Doolittle in his cockpit. You see the kind of shroud around the thing right there? What he did to make sure that people would actually believe this worked is he created a proof point. So he was sitting on the ground. He covered himself up in the shroud to where he couldn't see anything. Then he took off alone. He flew around on the instruments, and he came back, and he landed on the instruments. And people said, holy cow, this totally works. This totally works. And as any pilot can tell you, if you've done any pilot training, you have to go through the same confidence maneuver yourself to convince yourself that it works. You have to cover up your eyes, you have to not look outside, and trust the instruments, and by gosh, they give you a proof point, which is, to say it vastly changed aviation safety is as an understatement as you can get. This has enabled everything about aviation safety. From the beginning. So there's some augmented reality for safety. All right. So I think we've gone all the way back to the beginning of aviation. That's about the beginning of aviation. So we're going to now crawl ourselves back toward the modern day. You are probably familiar that in the military, we have long been on the lead end of virtual reality. And we'll call it simulation, typically, but basically this is a virtuality. So what you see here is an F-15 pilot in a simulator, and you can see he's got actual wingmen flying next to him. Those are people in other simulators that are allowing training. So we've had training forever. We've had simulator training forever in military aviation, as far back as World War I. Very, very basic things that allowed you to flip a switch or verify that something was going to happen. But today, we've really made it to where this simulated training is so good that the things that we can't do because they're either too expensive to do or because we don't have the capital assets sitting around in order to do, or that are just simply so dangerous that we never want to do them until we really have to do them, this has really filled the gap for us in aviation. So I'll give you just a couple examples. So I just learned how to fly the F-35. I had to go back and learn a new airplane, so they sent me to the course. And the second time, I guess, I'd gotten in one time. The second time I touched the airplane, that had actually seen the physical airplane, was my first and solo flight. So I hadn't ever flown with anybody in the airplane. I got in the airplane and flew the airplane, no problem, because I had spent the previous 3 weeks flying in a super high quality simulator. High quality enough that I will tell you that every time the simulation sessions ended, I thought to myself, oh, like I had to come back out of like, oh, I'm not actually flying. Like, oh my gosh, this was actually just a simulation. So these have gotten excessively good. If you've ever flown on a commercial airline, there's a good chance that the co-pilot on your flight, if it was their first flight with that airline, that's the first time they've ever sat in that jet, by the way. Don't think about it too hard, but because simulation is very, very, very good. So you guys saw the simulation talk about safety. That was an interesting thing. I think there's more than that out in construction. I think there's a lot of places that you would probably want to practice something before you did it, or your capital costs are too intense to do it all the time, or you want to see what's going to happen when it's dangerous. I think there's a ton of things there. The other anecdote I'll tell you about this is that pilots got a pilot, right? Pilots hate the sim, right? Like, nobody wants to fly around in a sim. You want to fly around the actual airplane. But the proof point here that these are so good is that the sort of, as an air-to-air pilot, the big capstone sortie that you would do is you would take 4 of your own airplane and you would go against an unknown, maybe let's say 8 number of enemy airplanes in the real airspace. 4 of you, 8 of them out in the airspace. You do a simulated battle. That's it. That's like the most important sortie you can do. And that, for a long time, had to be done in the air with real airplanes. You got to do it. But the simulation is so good now that folks would prefer to do it in the simulator. The training is so good that you would rather do it in the simulator. So how does that relate to efficiency? Well, it's $30,000 an hour to operate an airplane, a tactical airplane. And we just talked about 12 of them operating for a couple of hours. So I just talked about $750,000 worth of training assets that can be done in a simulator. Now, a simulator costs a little money, but it's not $30,000 an hour to operate, right? So huge efficiencies, and maybe you got something similar in your fields as well. All right, and finally, innovation. So I got a pointy talkie here. So you saw the Iron Man earlier, right? I got the real Iron Man helmet with me today, so not Stark Industries, but all right. So we talked about augmented reality before lunch as well. So for a long time, pilots have been using augmented reality in the form of a heads-up display. So that is a display that's in between you and the real world. It shows relative information. It's a pretty useful thing because you don't have to look down at the gauge. So this is what the next step in augmented reality looks like. So this is the F-35's helmet. You can see a picture of it behind me on the screen as well. So it's a head tracking device in which all the information that you need tactically is displayed on the visor right here. And not just when you're looking forward, but when you're looking backward, when you're looking to the side, when you're looking down. And in fact, when you fly at night and you can't really see anything, the whole jet is covered in sensors. And with a flick of a switch, you can see that sensor view in any direction you look in your helmet itself. So if you want to look down, you can look down, and you'll see the real picture created by the airplane below you. So this is probably, no exaggeration, as good as an augmented reality thing as that you're ever going to get. So why did I bring it up here to show you? A couple of reasons. Number one, This is the key to innovation in my industry. And maybe something similar is the key to innovation in your industry. Once you have this on your head, once you can look anywhere and see anything, the amount of things that you can do become nearly endless. And in fact, before you have it, you should consider yourself in augmented reality poverty. And I say that because it's not that you don't have good augmented reality, it's that you don't even know what you could do with augmented reality if you have it, right? Right? This gets you out of that augmented reality poverty because we are only now in the Air Force and the Navy and the Marines scratching the surface on what something like this can do for our tactical situational awareness, and for all the tactical flying that we do. This is only the beginning. That's number one. Number two, this is not cheap. That's why I'm holding it so carefully, right? It's not cheap, and by the way, this is the third version of the helmet that we have produced for the F-35. So I don't know if you watch F-35 news, but the first couple didn't work very well. So remember, we're talking about an airplane that's stealth, that flies supersonic, that has 30,000 pounds of thrust, that can hover, and the hardest thing that we're still working on is the helmet for AR. So I say that as a cautionary tale. You're also in the dangerous and dirty and dynamic and difficult kind of industry space that we are. When you operate in that space, it's not just Oculus Rift in the next room over, right? It's much harder than that. Shouldn't scare you away, but be prepared that you might have to do 1 or 2 or maybe 3 versions of your augmented reality thing before you go. All right. I'm going to set it down very gently now. I think I signed for it when I left the base. Okay, let's get there. Okay, so innovation from augmented reality. Okay, so to wrap it up, the whole point was for me to give you a take on a couple of technological areas from my business. So we talked about automation, we talked about augmented and virtual reality. I think we'll all agree, and we agreed from before lunch, that we can get safety out of that we can get efficiencies out of that, and we can get innovations out of that. A couple of key things that I want you to walk away with. Number one, proof points are essential to make those things happen. Once you have a proof point, the surge to adopt is almost unstoppable. Number two, you got to do it with the user in mind. The best answer in the world will get replaced by a wad of gum if you don't make it something that the users can use. And third, it is going to be hard to do. We work in difficult, dangerous, dirty environments. It's going to require a couple iterations, but it is worth it when you get there. All right. So that's the tale of paddling to stay ahead of technological change in tactical aviation. I will leave it to you if there are any questions coming in on the app. If there are, I'm happy to field. If not, I'm happy to step off.
If I can get the mic, thank you. Thank you so much. That was truly great.
Thanks.
Thank you. We have actually several questions, and so we have some time to tackle a few of those. Would you please describe your pre-job safety briefing process before flying?
Yeah. So pre-job safety. So the question is, describe pre-job safety briefing. Okay. I'm going to talk just a couple minutes on this, but I'm actually deeply interested, having not known a lot about construction until I was here today. We have very similar safety paradigms and problems because we know we're going to go do dangerous stuff. We can't just not do the dangerous stuff, right? Like, we have to go do dangerous stuff. So basically, before we fly, we spend about an hour and a half talking, briefing, before we could do a sortie. Of that hour and a half, a solid 25 minutes is pure safety topic. Every day, every time you fly, pure safety topic. To the point where you can rattle off those safety things over and over again because you got to do it, right? It's just a dangerous business. So that's kind of the first thing, is that a chunk of your preparation is dedicated just to safety. I think the second thing that's relevant to this crowd is that we do something called operational risk management. And I'm not sure if that's a term that goes outside of aviation or not, so maybe it's called something else in construction. But what you do there is you take your entire group that you're going to fly with, at maybe 4, 8, 12 airplanes, and you work through a worksheet together. Very, very mechanical worksheet. It just asks you some questions, and then it just gives you a number at the end of it. And it's not supposed to tell you to fly or not fly. It's supposed to make you aware that you have stacked risk on risk on risk, and you might be walking into something you're not familiar with. So there's questions like, how much sleep did you get last night? Have you ever done this mission before? How long has it been since you've done this mission? What's the weather like today? What are the airplanes like today? So just those questions alone, you start to stack those things up, and it might be that you get to where you're about to fly and you go, oh my gosh, I did not realize how young we are in this mission. I did not realize how much the weather is complicating things. I didn't realize how long it's been. Let's not. Or let's do it, but with our eyes wide open to risk. So there's a couple of things that might be relevant, I guess, to going out and doing tasks in construction.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. Of the three areas discussed, automation, safety, innovation, efficiency, which still has the greatest opportunity for improvement?
Okay, so I think, so yeah, if you look at safety, efficiency, innovation, I think safety is just like you guys showed the chart of fatalities and you want it to be zero, we're in the same business. In fact, our chart looks almost identical in military aviation. Our safety today in military aviation is worlds better than it was in 1975 or 1985 or even 1995. We are much, much better, and your chart shows the same thing. But that's still an area where we can get better because things that we thought we couldn't automate, things that we thought we couldn't use with VR and AR, we've realized now that we can, and we have to keep pushing to do those safety items. So a quick example is the ground collision avoidance system. So there are airplanes today, Air Force airplanes flying that could have ground collision avoidance in them that don't. Right? So number one, we know it works. We know it can be done at reasonable cost and time. Do it. The second thing is that we are ready to take the next step. So airplanes fighting against one another in a mock dogfight, one of the big risks remaining, besides hitting the ground, is hitting each other. So this is a very challenging problem, right? Because you might be closing at 1,500 miles an hour, and you might intentionally want to fly within about 500 feet of each other. So if you just do some quick physics, that's actually a pretty tight window in order to control. But we can answer that problem too. We can make sure that airplanes never collide with each other in the air if we wanted to. And that's another step we can take. So I think safety is really the place where those technologies ought to be still pushing and brought to bear.
Okay, thank you. Could you talk about the balancing of getting a new technology out in the field for people to figure out how to best use and ensuring the technology is ready?
Yeah, okay, so that's a great question. And I'm sure one that you guys see all the time. Okay, so a couple of things there. For sure, it's a balance, I think, in my opinion. Again, I worked the last year in Silicon Valley, so Silicon Valley's answer to this is easy. It's like minimum viable product, go. Get it out there, let the user use it, see how it works. And like, that's a cool attitude, it's a great, and it probably works at Airbnb, right? But like, no one ever got killed at their, well, maybe they did get killed at their Airbnb, I don't know, but Airbnb's website never killed anybody, but your crane could. And my F-35 could. So there's certainly a balance. You can't just push things out that are garbage. And we talked a little bit about change fatigue. You also can't just change and change and change and change on people because they never actually are able to use the system. So there's certainly a balance there. I'll tell you that traditionally in tactical aviation, we have kept our change at a very slow, relative to most industries' pace, of about 2.5 years. So airplanes change in the tactical air world about every 2.5 years. And that allows us enough time to train, to learn, to move forward. We want to do better than that in the Air Force, and we're getting ready to do better than that. So the plan today on the F-35 is that we're going to go to 6 months. 6 months, every 6 months, we're going to make the change in the field that makes a difference to the airplane, that gets something out there for the user to use to tell us how it's working so we can get the next thing out. So I think we're struggling with that balance as well. I'll just say in aviation, and this isn't my business, but we've seen in the news that modifying the airplane for automation carries risks as well. So there is a too fast, right? There is a too fast. It is out there. Yeah.
Okay. Of all the technological advancements, which are you most proud of when you reflect back on your career?
Okay. So this is not one of the things I talked about, but one of the big things that makes a tactical airplane work is radars. And I won't get you into radar theory, but the big picture is you put something on the front of the airplane, it sends out about a bunch of radio waves, you get some information back, and that's how you determine where things are and what you're going to do. We have, over the last 10 years, totally revolutionized radars on the front of airplanes. And that was a long, long struggle, like any technology, to bring it in young, to see the first generation, to replace that with the second generation, to go through all the work to get things back to where they needed to be from all the perspectives of the performance. And I got the chance to play a role in that as a test guy. And so when I look at the tactical air fleet, that's kind of the place I say, yeah, we made a difference there, because our airplanes are world-class when it comes to radar.
How do you manage quality in all these initiatives?
Yeah, so like quality, how do you manage quality in the initiatives? It's the exact same question, not the same question, related to the same question about speed before, right? So there's a standard of quality that can't go below, and I think you have to make a decision on what are you really doing. Am I changing my billing interface? Like I could probably take some quality, you know? Am I changing my control interface for the backhoe? Like probably can't change the quality on that.
There's a few questions here, so I think we have time for 2 more.
All right.
Any thoughts on Supermax?
On what?
Supermax.
Supermax. I don't know. I don't have the context on that.
Who asked that question? Supermax. Boeing.
Oh, on the 737. Yeah, so I kind of hinted at it just a second ago, and honestly, like I wouldn't want to throw anything at the Boeing company. Obviously, automation can be dangerous. I will give one interesting example. Does anybody drive a car that has auto collision avoidance on it? Yeah? I just bought a Subaru. Like, I grew up in Colorado, so like for me, this is like the high point of my life. I'm driving a Subaru now. Like, I made it. I'm gonna put a kayak and a bike on it just cause. So I drove from Florida in the Subaru, this brand new car, and was like going through the owner's manual just kind of lazily, and I realized it has like an automatic stopping mode on it. Like, I don't know how it works. Like, I've been wearing my seatbelt because what if it fails? And I go through the windshield. Like, so that's actually relevant to the 737 because there's a case of where there's a safety system on a vehicle that you might be operating that you don't actually know is there, or how to turn it off, or what it's going to do, or when it might fail, or what it might do when it activates. So I think that's maybe the dark side of automation there, and it doesn't have to just be right at Boeing, but there's probably a lot of things like that might activate, and you may not know what to do, which appeared to be the case.
Okay, thank you. That was a hard one. So last question, I think, will help summarize things. Great presentation. It says, what are your personal 2 to 3 most important best practices for leading change initiatives in your team? By the way, thank you so much for your service to our country.
Oh, well, that was a kind question. Thank you. Yeah, so I think I hit on them. The one that I want you to walk away more than anything with is that proof matters. Like, real proof matters. So I don't know how you're going to get proof. It depends on what you're doing. These guys that came up with Auto GCAS, their proof came to them. They put the system in, and, whatever, 6 weeks later, 8 weeks later, someone sent them a tape and said, look. So I think proof really, really matters. I think I would walk away with that. I think the other thing that I would want you to walk away with is that user is deeply important. You probably have the right engineering answer in the long run. But if you don't work with your Gabby Gubreskis, your aces, your guys that are out there on the line, they're going to replace it with gum. And you're not going to get anywhere. So maybe those are the 2 things that are the most important as you seek to paddle down this river and stay ahead of the current. Well, that'll close.
Thank you so
Thanks,
much.
guys.